Very good. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ray Perman. I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and welcome to the third of our seminars in this autumn series. Before I introduce our speaker and chair for this evening, I'll just draw your attention to the next one, which comes very hot on the heels of this one in 8 days' time. Anton Muscatelli, the principal of Glasgow University and also president of the David Hume Institute, will be giving his presidential lecture and returning to the theme which we had in the last seminar when a presentation by David Bell on inequality in Scotland, the theme of inequality, but this time putting it in a national and international context. If you haven't registered for that seminar and you would like to come, then I urge you to do it quickly because it is filling up very fast. This evening's seminar is on the subject of well-being, and like inequality, well-being is attracting a lot of attention at the moment, not only from academics looking at what it actually means, but also from policymakers. And there is legislation going through the Scottish Parliament currently which would require some understanding and measure of well-being to be built into policies in the future. So the University's Insight Institute, in partnership with a number of other organisations, including Carnegie UK, of which Sir John Elvidge is a trustee, have been looking at this issue of well-being in Scotland and how it can be incorporated into the national performance framework so that it can be used to assess policy. A presentation is from Professor Charlie Woods of the University's Insight Institute, and then afterwards I will disappear from the rostrum, and Sir John, whom you will know as former permanent secretary of the Scottish Government, but tonight here in his capacity for Carnegie UK, will chair the discussion after that. When we're all finished, then there'll be drinks in the foyer and you can continue the discussion there. But in the meantime, I'll hand over to Charlie Woods.
Thanks, Ray. That was a much kinder introduction than the one I heard one chairman give a speaker once where he said, "Have you got slides or have you got something to say?" Well, I've got a load of slides, actually, but I hope I've got something to say as well, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. The Insight Institute is a joint venture of 8 research-intensive universities in Scotland dedicated to the idea of trying to share knowledge, mobilise knowledge in Scotland between academics and between policymakers, practitioners, and the wider public. And it's a great opportunity for us to be able to present some of the work that has been done under our Wellbeing programme, to give you some feedback on that. But also, what we'd hope to get is some feedback from you about some of the things that we're saying as part of that work. First thing, and Ray touched on this, the first thing I wanted to say though was to thank the policy and practitioner partners that have been involved in this work. Specifically those that have co-sponsored it, like Carnegie UK Trust and Scottish Enterprise and SEPA and SNH, but also the Futures Forum and the Parliament, who have been very strong in their support and providing facilities for a number of the events. So to be able to hold those events in the Parliament, I think, is important for our work. Also the government as well, because we will talk a bit about the National Performance Framework, but the government officials that have been part of the work have been very forthcoming in being willing to share ideas and thoughts about how the National Performance Framework can be developed. All of the participants there have been from the third sector and other organisations have contributed a lot in their time, and being an informal steering group to our work, and it's the first time we've done that. We've really benefited from that. So a big thank you to all of the partners. The call for proposals that we set out was really trying to look at three main elements in the program. Firstly, to try and develop a deeper understanding of what influences well-being and for individuals and society. Then look at how you might appropriately measure or assess progress as far as well-being is concerned. But also to look at what some of the implications for policy and how best you might promote it. And the essence of what our work involves is a knowledge exchange program. It's not fundamental research. It's taking fundamental research and building on that and mixing it with the experience of policymakers and practitioners in a number of different events. The specific projects that comprise the programs are listed here. And they're a real mix of taking a fairly sort of broad-based approach to this, such as the Good Lives and Decent Societies and the economics of well-being approach, down to taking more specific looks at the whole topic of well-being, specifically things like the Walking for Well-being and the home and housing dimension to the whole. So we had a real mix of broad and specific activities. And we have 15 events across Scotland with over 500 people taking part, and a real mix of different people, which is the essence of what this is. So a lot of new networks developed there, which I think will be important in the future. And also 2 MOOCs, massive online open courses, under development at the moment, which will try and be another way in which we can share some of the learning more broadly from this work. You can see from that list, this is a pretty broad range of activities and a lot of work that has gone into this so far. What I am going to try and do tonight is not to summarize it, but to synthesize from it. So I'll be drawing on some of the things that emerged from each of the projects. And I suppose at times I will be adding my interpretation as well. So the disclaimer is that I'm responsible for what I'm saying, and if I misrepresent anything that has been said during the course of the program, I'm sorry, but hopefully that won't be the case. But this is my synthesis of what's been done. So I'm not going to do justice by definition in the 3/4 an hour or so that I have available to all the wealth of stuff that's been done. But I would, if you are interested in this area, I would draw your attention to our website, and we'll make both the slides and the website available. But on the website, there is a specific page where each of the projects listed there in the blue, you can click onto those and get much more. I hope there's a real wealth of material in terms of blogs, presentations, papers, and the like in each of those topic areas. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to go and take a look at the website. So first of all, then, first question: what do we mean by well-being? I mean, it's a phrase which is bandied around quite a lot. I think there's probably quite a few interpretations to it. There are a lot of issues of framing. It's certainly more than simply being about health. Often it's banded in the health and well-being area. It's more than about money, and in essence, that's what I think drives a lot of the well-being work, is to try and find a description of societal progress which goes beyond simply assessing the total output of society. And there's a danger that it might fall into sort of slightly sort of new age, touchy-feely sort of category. It's not that as well. It's something much. While it's a slippery concept, it's not totally ambiguous, and there's quite a lot we can do to begin to define it. Measurement can help define it. Oh, sorry, I should have moved that on. Measurement can help define it, but the language can definitely be off-putting. Measurement can also distract and mislead as well. This point about the language being off-putting, there was a really nice point in one of the programs, the GLADS program, where Neil Finn, one of the leaders of that group, was drawing attention to the sort of the rather clumsy language that's used in talking about well-being. And the reason for the musical notation there was that he was saying that if you can't sing the words that you're using in reference to well-being, you're probably not hitting the right note. So I thought that was an interesting thought just to take away. So hasten to add, I'm not going to try and sing tonight. That would be going too far. I wouldn't do anything for your well-being. So, but let's just explore into this what is well-being a little further. And I thought, given that it was David Hume Institute, actually some reference back to the thinker who the institute was set up to remember and recognise. And he drew attention to the importance of the attainment of happiness being at the core of what society and its various component parts was all about. The GLADS program that I've mentioned already also took a historical perspective in looking at a number of quotes from Framer Scott and others as well. And it is interesting to see how often the importance of happiness, both in the drafting of the American Constitution, but also with Francis Hutcheson and others like Bentham, drawing attention to the importance of happiness for the greatest numbers. And one thing I found particularly interesting was that the man who John Sinclair, who coined the term of statistics, drew attention to the fact that it was the government should be using statistics to try and assess a quantum of happiness. So there is definitely something about happiness that lies behind this idea of well-being, and I think quite a lot has been said recently about this. The work that Richard Layard did early in the 2000s to draw attention to the importance of that. But despite all the work that's been done, I think it is often misunderstood and underestimated, and it's probably often seen in terms of it's a slightly sort of soft favourite things type word. I like this quote from Paul Dolan, who wrote a recent book about happiness by design, that it's a noble and serious subjective, the pursuit of happiness. And the idea that it in some way combines two very different concepts, pleasure and purpose, and it's that mix of pleasure and purpose which drives happiness and the quality of one's experience. There's been quite a lot of work done on trying to assess how people feel about their lives, and they're broadly two broad approaches. One, the sort of the hedonic well-being approach, which basically tries to assess how people are feeling at any particular moment in time. The other around life satisfaction, which is a much more evaluative approach, looking back at how satisfied people are with their life. And I think it is this mixture of experience and evaluation that is quite important for me. And this mix of systems 1 and 2. I don't know how many of you are aware of the work that Daniel Kahneman has done about looking at the two different types of systems of thinking that we have. One subconscious and automatic, the other much more conscious and has to be switched on to work. In a way, this mixture of experience and evaluation, it really fits in well with this mixture of system 1 and 2, the subjective and the objective. And there are elements of perception and reality in all of this as well. I'll come back to that point on perception and reality. This slide, this chart here, taken from the Economist a few years back, illustrates another important factor which has been identified, that by and large, people's happiness is U-shaped relative to their age. So that you start off as a teenager, a young person, pretty happy. Things decline a bit into middle age, and by the time you get to around 50, 55, then things are beginning to pick up again. So looking at the audience, I'm not really too sure about where that places you, but I thought that might offer some sort of encouragement as far as the future. I think the theory is that by the time you've reached that age, then you realise that those hopes and expectations that you hope you might fulfill might not all have been achieved, but you might as well just get on and enjoy life anyway. So so maybe some hope there. So that's really, I'm looking at it there from a sort of an individual context, but I think it's always important, and all the way through we try to think about both individual well-being and societal well-being and the relationship and the relationship between the two. And at the conference we had in the Parliament last week, we were reminded of Muhammad Ali's shortest poem when he was asked at some presentation at Harvard to give the audience a poem, and he came up with "me, we." And I thought that's quite a nice way of bridging into this idea that happiness is more than just the happiness of the individual. It's very much about the relationship with society as a whole. And one of the things which came up in a number of different contexts during the course of the programme was the importance of giving in making people happy and making society a happier place. I was surprised to find out that actually those that give up their time in a voluntary capacity tend to feel they have more time to spare. So it's a rather counterintuitive finding there. They're also quite strong. This ties in with both David Bell's presentation last time and the next presentation, that levels of inequality and happiness, particularly in developed countries, there seems to be quite a strong relationship there, and particularly regarding the impact on fairness and trust. And I suppose that ties us back to another past thinker, well known in this city, that that the importance of impartiality in assessing the overall happiness of society. No one person is more important than others. So a few thoughts then on happiness, both societally and individually, which draws us into the question then of what is it that influences well-being. And the work that's been coming out of the programme seems to have focused on three, we all like alliteration, three P's here, around people, participation and place. And they're drawn as overlapping circles because while I've put some things in each of the circles, there's an element to which they could also fit into other circles as well. I quite liked the comment from Carrie Exton of the OECD, who took part in one of the seminars, that we've got a list of ingredients, but no one set recipe for how those ingredients might necessarily come together. And I think that's a good thought to bear in mind. So as far as people's concerned, actually having some sense of agency and control, some sense of purpose seems to be particularly important. Obviously having the resources and the physical and mental health to be able to participate, the skills and knowledge to be able to participate, and there's the sustenance. And sustenance might think of that as simply in terms of food, but I think that sort of extends into sort of the cultural and spiritual area as well. And again, linking from the individual to the wider society, participation appears to be a critical element. Particularly within community, it's a way of providing engagement and voice and access to activities. And often, and this is a good area where these circles overlap, some of the things you're talking about as far as participation are rooted in a particular place. Although increasingly, and not always, increasingly virtual communities, I think, are being seen as being quite important sources of community as well. Employment is a pretty critical part of participation. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in detail, as are connections and as is giving as well. So it's not just what you receive, it's what you can give. And the very act of giving both contributes to well-being of others, but actually increases your well-being. The final area of place, a lot of this is drawn together. The home, the community, the neighbourhood, the place of safety, the environment, both natural and built, the degree of fairness and freedom that exists within a place, and the cultural underpinnings of the place, all seem to be key parts of the mix. And there are many models of well-being and how these things fit together. This is one that I've taken from some work that Neil Thin did in the GLADS programme, which is again taken from reference there below. I think one of the important things about all of these models, and if you're interested in these models, I would encourage you to go and look at Neil's presentation that's available on the website, because he goes through quite a number of them there, is that all of the elements are in some way interrelated with each other. So this notion of the system is as important as any one of the individual parts, which I think maybe something we could discuss further. Okay, so many models of well-being. I've touched on some of the individual elements. There are some I just wanted to try and draw out a little bit more. And one is around income, because a lot has been talked about how how levels of happiness tail off as income rises, and clearly the impact of income where people don't have very much income, adding income to them makes a huge difference to their life satisfaction. This curve was being referred to, as a number of you will know, as the Easterlin paradox, after the economists that identified it, probably getting on for 30 years or so ago now. It's interesting that some further work has suggested there is a relationship between income and happiness, but it's a log linear relationship, i.e. that it's the percentage increase in your income related to happiness. There's a much more linear relationship between that, which has obviously generated quite an interesting amount of talk and discussion. I still think this suggests that the biggest bangs for the buck, to a certain extent, as far as increasing his income is concerned, can be had towards the lower end of the scale. I should have said, actually, this is for different countries, but you get similar patterns within individual countries as well. What does definitely seem to be the case is there is a clearer relationship between income and life satisfaction than there is between income and the more hedonic description of happiness, and that certainly work that Kahneman and Deaton did suggests that with a household income of above $75,000, the relationship, even the log linear relationship between income and happiness, seems to tail off at around that point. So it's the idea that there is this tail off there is not entirely uncontested. Other important things as far as income is concerned is the role of adaptation, that we have a psychological tendency to adapt to things that happen to us, good things and bad things, so that we adapt quite quickly to increases in income and just take them as the new norm. We can adapt quite quickly to bad things that happen to us as well. Although, interestingly, I said I'd come back to employment or unemployment. Unemployment seems to be an area where the scarring effects of unemployment seem to be much longer lasting than many other bad things that can happen to people. And David Bell and Danny Blanchard have done some work looking at the relative importance of different macroeconomic indicators, and have found that the relationship between well-being and unemployment is 2.5 times greater than the 2.5 times increase in unemployment rate has as much impact as a 1 percentage point increase in the inflation rate. So that varies with country to a certain extent as well. So that's maybe something that we want to talk about. So there are so macro issues have a difference here as well, and context is important. Underemployment, again, work from David. Some of the bad effects of unemployment are also reflected in unemployment and uncertainty in people in employment if they face the prospect of unemployment. So that's that's a key factor to think about in terms of looking at what influences well-being. Reality and perception. I mentioned that. I think this is quite an important thing. That this graph here is about unemployment levels and how people estimate what the level of unemployment is. And this is based on a recent poll that was done by Ipsos Murray. So and basically what you can see is that the average guess is listed in this column here. The actual rate listed in that column, so the bar is actually the difference between those across a range of different countries. So big differences in how people perceive things as to how they actually take place in reality. Often this is presented as a sort of demonstration of ignorance. But I think it's also important to say if this is how the world is seen, then this has an important part of important impact on well-being. And back to the whole idea of the System 1 thinking that Daniel Kahneman talks about, it draws, if we think of the role, some of the biases that are subconscious that can lead us into this idea of associative coherence. Once we get an idea in our head, it was very difficult to shift it. We look for confirming evidence of that. We're actually resistant to anything which might run counter to it. And the reactive devaluation about how we devalue comments that are made from certain people and give much more credence to others. This is probably having these perceptions are having an important and significant effect. It may have something something that relates to maybe the crisis in politics as is being described as we see it at the moment. So I don't think it's right. You can only ignore it or dismiss it. I think we need to acknowledge it and recognise it before beginning to move on to look in more detail at the evidence and try and think about explanations. If you just dive straight into the explanation, then people are unlikely to actually listen to what's being said. And I think there's a lot of signs of that's what's happening on a whole range of issues at the moment. So reality and perception, I think, is an important component of this. And that leads us on to the whole issue of societal well-being that we've already touched on a bit. It's more than the sum of the individual parts, not least because of the external social costs and benefits and the sorts of vicious and virtuous circles that can develop as far as the feedback loops within society are concerned. Work at Aberdeen University, which was highlighted in the Pathways programme, highlights the 4 elements of societal well-being. Firstly, the security side, the socio-economic security in terms of the social wage, the investment that's made over the life cycle within society, the cohesion that builds trust, the inclusion that comes from participating in what goes on within society, and the empowerment that's achieved through voice, and in fact, and his work taking place within Aberdeen in terms of developing the measurements of these things into a much more coherent measure of societal well-being. The one thing that seems to be important, and I'll come back to this in my conclusions, is that the way in which you engage people in dialogue about societal well-being is absolutely crucial. And I think this was from the Home Not Housing programme. These points of being inclusive, empathetic, empowering, creating, systemic are all important as far as that dialogue is concerned. And it differs from in different geographies as well, and that's something that has to be recognised. Which brings us on to the role of place, and I mentioned the Home Not Housing work there, which tried to sort of move beyond housing. I see Douglas is in the audience here. Any questions on this? Douglas can elaborate further on, but drew I think an interesting distinction between the home, where reactions are generally positive, and as far as the impact on people's well-being, although there are obviously examples where the home is not necessarily the positive environment for well-being, but through a whole range of things, from physical security to emotional security to the importance of love as well. And that word love was used quite a lot, which made a lot of us feel rather uncomfortable, but probably is not unimportant as far as this is concerned. And neighbourhood as well, almost at one level, the extension of home, where there were some very positive impacts on well-being, but at the same time there could be some quite negative impacts as well, and they're almost the opposites of each other. There's an opportunity to connect. It's also a place where division can take place. It's a focal point for giving people some sort of agency over their lives, but it's also done wrongly can disempower people. It can enhance security or it can diminish security. So I think this place dimension was one of the things which came out in a number of different ways, but most specifically within the home not housing work. And place was also important, and this program touched on it, but others did as well. The Walking and the Glads program touched on this. The importance of green space on well-being. And that can be directly through the impact on physical and mental health. There's quite a lot of work has been looking at the levels of cortisol and the reduced stress that comes both from access to space, to green space, and also I think there's an element of psychic income in this as well, in terms of your knowledge that you can access green space is important. Directly through physical activity, and apparently the impact of physical activity taken outside on well-being is more significant than being in the gym, which is great news as far as I'm concerned. Social engagement as well. It's also the green space an opportunity for social engagement. And work that Matthew White did at Exeter, who came up and spoke at the economics work, in particular, drew out. They've done some comparisons and about the significance of the green. So it's less than the importance of employment. It's less than the importance of marriage, but it's still significant in terms of the mix. And apparently, similar work has been done for blue space as well, and particularly in reference to coastal communities, the impact that it has on well-being. I actually asked the question about if you were trying to sort of boil down what the essence of that natural environment was, and it seems to be that some combination of trees and water are quite an important driver as far as this is concerned. The other thing I wanted to mention before moving on to the measurement was the importance of trying to think as systemically as possible in how we think about well-being. And beyond sort of narrow cause and effects. And I think well-being approaches generally try and they're an opportunity to move beyond that. So, for example, from the Walking for Wellbeing work, if you've got more active transportation, it can have a direct physical impact on your well-being. But there's also an indirect impact, for example, via the improvement in the environment, the better health activities, the lower sick leave, the increased productivity, income, tax revenues, and that. So I think thinking about these synergies and trying to draw them out is an important part of trying to take a well-being approach. Okay, so that's really trying to synthesize some of the points as far as what influences well-being is concerned. How about measurement? And when we originally started, we were using the term measurement, but I think one of the things which came through from a number of the discussions that maybe a different framing of that would be assessment rather than measurement, and that's trying to broaden the way when we can talk more about that. Measurement I think it's now pretty widely seen as being more than about the GDP and the economy, not surprisingly, otherwise we wouldn't have done all this work. And it's important to recognise that Scotland is seen as being a world leader in this field, both as a result of the development of the National Performance Framework, but also as a result of work that others, such as Oxfam, have done with their Humankind Index. if you look, and Carnegie did some work on this a couple of years ago, looking at various different approaches across the OECD, rest of the UK, Scotland, and the Canadian and the Virginian experience, and you see that the common threads seem to be appearing, not surprisingly, given what we've said about what influences well-being in all of the frameworks. All of the countries try and take a holistic view of this, but one of the things that everyone emphasises, and particularly we had an interesting contribution from former chief statistician of the OECD, that there are no simple answers about this as far as this goes. But we start from a good place. So we have the National Performance Framework, which is set as the yardstick. The government actually sets as a yardstick for government policy, but I think it actually is broader than that. It is much more an attempt to try and assess society's progress. The government very much looks at it in reference to the overarching purpose, specific targets related to that purpose, what the strategic objectives are, what national outcomes you are trying to achieve. You won't be able to read this, but you can look at this. This is a list of the outcomes, and then 50 or so indicators that help you understand the degree to which those outcomes are being achieved. So already in place, a great first step in terms of trying to take a holistic view. This work was constantly reviewed, but there's a fairly major review taking place at the moment. So the opportunity to contribute ideas and thoughts to this has been much appreciated. I mentioned Scotland's another area, the Humankind Index that Oxfam developed, and this was, I think the interesting thing about this was, again, and some of the sorts of things that are being captured and measured within this relate to what we were talking about influences. But in terms of trying to build an index, and that's one of the issues, the degree to which you should try and have an overall index, or you should have a dashboard of measures. But in trying to build this index, then Oxfam went through a fairly major program of consultation with people, asking them what they felt was most important, and the weights in that second column there are derived from that survey. So that was an active engagement with people to try and both identify what should be measured and how it should be weighted. And that's one of the things the OECD has taken another approach through its Better Life, How's Life Work. And again, you can see the various elements that they're trying to capture within their framework. They're also trying to build in some notion of sustainability of assets and capital over time. I thought this comment at the bottom here was interesting. That it's placing the needs and aspirations of individuals and societies at the centre of development policy, and that the areas which probably needed greater development were around governance, civic engagement, connections, job quality, and the others that are listed there at the top. So there are a number of national approaches being taken. There are some international approaches. The other thing with the OECD work is you can actually interrogate that yourself and weight things that you see as being important. That's quite interesting to do that exercise and see comparisons. So there's a lot going on there. So what were some of the issues that actually emerged from it? Well, not surprising given what I've just said about what the OECD did. Effectively engaging people in both developing and monitoring measures, it seems to be absolutely crucial. There is a notion that in trying to measure it, you might end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So is there a way in which you can capture more of the spirit of well-being? Is there a way in which, alongside the data, you can actually have a series of stories and other descriptions which can bring to life some of the data, which might be difficult for some people to engage with? I think there's an acceptance of the need for a systemic approach, as I've talked about, that it does mix. Most approaches mix subjective and objective measures to some extent. Some focus more on the subjective feelings of well-being and happiness than others. that trying to capture reality and perception is obviously quite a difficult. It's relatively easy to measure reality, but trying to combine that with how people are feeling about things like crime, the fear of crime, those sorts of things is certainly an issue. And there is a big issue around whether or not a dashboard approach is the most appropriate one. The downside of that is a very complex approach, 50-odd indicators within the national performance framework, difficult for people to get their heads around. But the danger with an index, at least you get one number at the end of that, which you can monitor its progress against. But there's a danger that in putting all of the numbers into that index, you oversimplify things. And it very much does depend on how you weight domains and indicators within that. So I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I think at the moment we're at a stage where we understand that indexes and dashboards can both play a role here. And that maybe looking for a replacement for GDP, where a lot of this work actually starts from, as Enrico Giovanni from the OECD said, was a bit like searching for the holy grail. Often you have to use proxy measures because what you can actually measure isn't necessarily getting to the heart of what you want to get at. If you do that, you've got to be careful, and trying to keep focused on the outcome that you have in mind, which is why the National Performance Framework has at its core the set of outcomes before the indicators, which in some way relate to a theory of change that you're trying to work towards promoting, is also an issue which is seen as important as well. So those are some of the issues. Some of the ideas as far as developing the National Performance Framework is concerned, there are a number. So I mean, this is not really doing justice to those. I mean, obviously the feedback was it was an excellent start. Maybe there was a way of reframing the purpose that to provide a greater well-being focus, with the possible areas of where greater emphasis should be given. Not surprisingly, given what we've been talking about, inequality, distribution of a whole range of different things came up here, both income and wealth, health, also income intergenerational distribution as well. Trying to focus more on, again, tying in with the Scottish Government's approach of asset-based development, and giving more prominence, again, given what we've said about unemployment, to unemployment. A whole range of things around trying to capture some sense of quality of relationship, of neighbourhood, of work, and the like. So again, this is trying to put some qualitative elements into what tends to be a quantitative process. One area which isn't explicitly covered within the framework is volunteering. I'll say a little bit more about that. Access to the natural environment, and not surprising what I've said, and the degree to which businesses are adopting ethical business practices around fair trade, around living wage and the like, could be an area, could be considered. As I said, the government has been very open and very engaged with this process, and I know we'll be talking further with the teams that have been involved in this as the NPF is developed. I said something about volunteering. We think this is one area where which could definitely benefit, not least because it is a powerful tool for change. There are benefits, as I've already said, there are benefits to both the giver and the receiver, and that the value of work that's already being done is not insignificant in this regard. 2.6 billion a year is the estimate the Volunteer Scotland have put on this. So the potential for developing an indicator is being worked through as a result of the work that has been done on this programme. Finally, on measurement, further thoughts on developing the NPF. There were some specific comments on particular indicators. There was also thought being given to how you relate the national performance framework to local and community frameworks. And an attempt, obviously the flip side of that, of a more asset-based approach is a less deficit-based approach, although recognising that sometimes it's easier to measure the deficits than it is the assets. That's probably an area that requires some further work. And one thought that was generally speaking, given we're starting with a sort of a 50 indicator model at the moment, the notion of one in, one out was probably something that should be given some serious thought to, because it's actually very easy to keep adding things to this, but making sure that you keep the whole thing manageable is crucial as well. Right. So trying to draw towards some conclusions as far as policy and practice is concerned. Why should we use a well-being framework? And I think there are a number of areas that are identified as being important in this regard. Not least, the measurement framework helps you identify gaps and begin to pose questions. It's a basis for stimulating dialogue and engaging people. It does focus on the Christie Commission principles of prevention and joining up action. And it can actually be a focus for trying to enable citizens as well. And this drawing, John, is probably recognised from, John kind of came along and talked at the conference we had in the Parliament last week and drew these two-shaped triangles about trying to move from the more traditional sort of top-down decide, design and deliver approach to an approach which is much more geared around engagement and empowering and enabling. And those of you who've read John's work for the Carnegie UK Trust that's a good source for exploring this in a bit more depth. And as already been mentioned, it can be a tool for assessing both direction, budgets, and specific policies. And Oxfam have done some work in doing this. Parliamentary budget scrutiny already relates to the measurement framework, and as Ray mentioned, taking this further through legislation is something that is underway at the moment as well. I suppose if you're trying to boil it down for me, and it's almost an impossible task to do, I seem to have done something here which won't allow me to. There we go. How about that? Trying to boil down okay, well, we're about insights here. So what is the central insight of all of this? Is that actively involving citizens in setting direction, deciding priorities, developing policies, and identifying measures and monitoring process is absolutely crucial. That's coming out in each of the programs, and that this will have an impact on well-being in its own right. If we're talking about the importance of agency and voice to people's well-being, at the same time as giving you probably a better chance of actually developing policies and programs which are more effective in actually delivering the sort of society that people desire to live in. And I quite like this quote from Joe Stiglitz, that while metrics are important, they're not a substitute for the dialogue that the metrics actually engender. So don't throw the baby out with bathwater as far as that's concerned. And sense is what brings the individual and societal dimensions of this together. And that we have in Scotland, I think, quite a lot to build on here. What you might call, as one of the teams did, engagement by design. Much was made of the energy that was generated by the referendum dialogue and debate, and how do we build on that and bottle it and build it? Well, I think this engagement, enabling and empowerment is a key part of that. It might actually go some way to beginning to address what's seen as the sort of crisis in conventional politics, as long as you actually start by acknowledging the frustration that's there. Although engagement in itself, and that's why I think the distinction between engagement, enablement and empowerment are important. Engagement in itself is not sufficient. It needs, people need to be enabled and empowered to do this through skills, knowledge, ownership of assets, understanding of evidence. But I think there is a direction of travel that this is flowing on building on in Scotland here as well. I've listed some of the things there that, not least, that we actually have a fair degree of experience and a fair degree of expertise within our public sector, within our public agencies, within our NGOs, and with a number of private organisations. And I'm involved in a number that are actively involved in trying to build on this direction of travel. One example of that, which I'll just finish with, is the work that the team in Aberdeen did in there. You'll see a number, I think it's one of the charts here, where in terms of trying to capture some of the dialogue and discussion they used a series of cartoons. One of the sessions was with young people in Aberdeen. So there is a lot on which we can build here to actively engage, enable and empower people to build a society which genuinely focuses on the greater well-being of the individuals within it and the society as a whole. So I hope that's given you some flavour of the work that we've done. As it was a huge amount of work. I've skated over quite a lot of it. Happy to try and build on that in the question and discussion. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. I have two pieces of good news for you. One is that Charlie welcomes feedback as well as questions. So if you want to make a point, you don't have to engage in the traditional pretense that you're asking a question. You can simply make your point. And two, that I'm going to give you airtime in a ratio of roughly 3-to-1 to Charlie. So I'll take people's contributions in bunches of 3, and then give Charlie an opportunity to reflect or respond to what people said. So, who wants to kick us off? Please.
Charlie, John, that was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Bob Black, former Auditor General, now retired gentleman doing various things. Can I come back to this issue about, you mentioned in one of the slides, Charlie, that this framework can be used to assess budgets and specific policies. And perhaps my question is, how can you make practical use of this to make hard choices? And the two key words I would perhaps use are the equality dimension and the attribution dimension. You had that most encouraging slide for those of us a certain age, the U-bend of happiness. As an aside, I'd be interested to know what happens once you get to 85. This is becoming an increasingly relevant question for me and possibly for some others in this audience. But the serious point is, when you get into the years of discretion, the third age, you have an index like pension, you've got free bus passes, free prescriptions. If you look at spend per head on the health service, and particularly over the lifestyle, it increases almost exponentially in the final years of life. And there are some really hard choices to be made as to whether society can afford that. I'm not entirely clear how this framework will help politicians make these hard choices. And secondly, on the issue of attribution, one of the things that I'm enjoying doing is working with Shelter, chairing the Commission on Housing and Wellbeing. And the other day there, I attended the annual lecture of Shelter given by Danny Alexander, which was truly excellent, I have to say. And from the floor, I talked about, how we'd identified 8 dimensions of housing and well-being. Housing is home, neighborhood quality, health, education, employment, income, environmental sustainability, and community safety. And the finance secretary was very interested in that. But he said, if you want to have an impact, then you need to be able to demonstrate attribution. How can housing contribute to these? Bearing in mind, my words, not his, that hard-nosed, highly intelligent people in the Treasury will be making tough decisions in the face of, as Fiscal Affairs Scotland has demonstrated in Scotland just this week, we're looking at something close to 30% cuts in real terms in budgets and non-protected areas in Scotland over most of this decade. So there's the issue of the equality and hard choices and the issue of attribution.
Thanks, Bob. And can I encourage others to follow Bob's excellent example of starting by saying who they are when they want to make points? Anyone else want to chip in at this point?
I'm Jeremy Peat, formerly of this parish. Thank you very much, Charlie, for a fascinating talk, which I expected to be as interesting as it was. I think I wanted to make 2 points. One is to follow on with what Bob Black just said about the difficulty of developing a framework, a means of aiding decision-making. I think that is the Holy Grail, et cetera, et cetera. But I just wonder whether there would be greater benefits, at least in the short to medium term from this work, from identifying 4 or 5 quick wins as to what can be achieved and achieved readily, which would almost certainly enhance well-being without significant costs, without significant difficulties of implementation, and which would get a long way along the road. You mentioned the issue of volunteering, the question of access to green space, blue space, whatever. There are things that can be done to improve community access, to encourage volunteering, and I'm sure there are 3 or 4 others that one could pick up that would perhaps make a significant impact and could be achieved without running into the difficulties of A, changing the NPF so that it has the right parameters in it, and then B, seeing that that's actually utilized in decision making, which may not always be the case in practice, even though it is in theory. And the second point I wanted to make was that you touched fairly lightly on the relationship between inequalities and well-being. And the curve where you showed the log linear relationship between income and well-being, and suggested that the same relationship applied within each nation as applies across nations, I thought seems to demonstrate that perhaps the greatest contribution that could be made from a utilitarian perspective of increasing well-being would be actually by reducing the extent of inequalities quite significantly, whereas, as we know, in the UK, the movement has been in the other direction, with the top 1% gaining more and more, and the skew of inequalities just getting greater. And the difficulty there is that actually the real solution may lie in reducing the extent of inequalities, but doing so in the context of a very competitive global world and within a United Kingdom for one nation may be more difficult than the other measures. So I just wonder whether you could comment on the difficulties of dealing with the inequalities issue and whether there are some quick hits that you could actually be getting on with while the thinking continues. Thank you.
Okay, lot there, but to keep my promise, there's room for one more on the bus. Yes, you, Duncan, yes.
Duncan McLennan, University of St Andrews and Glasgow. I had 2 questions of a technical nature. We have a long history in economics and welfare economics that tells us about the impossibility of interpersonal comparisons of utility or well-being or welfare, and the impossibility of adding them up to make decisions about how you allocate resources. We also have a framework that actually, quite rightly, as you point out, tends to focus on measures of GDP that omits natural capital, social capital, place capital. So I want to know whether or not you see this as an additional framework or a substitute for GDP per capita, because I think whether you take Easterlin's proposition or you look at individual life cycles, I think real disposable GDP per capita is probably a very good single measurable indicator of how people are. So I'd like to know whether it's a substitute or not. The second thing that worries me is, and I've done a lot of work at World Bank and elsewhere on indicators, and particularly for cities, there's so much multicollinearity between different indicators. Do you have clear logic chains that go from specific actions or sectors to dimensions of well-being to measured indicators? Because otherwise, measurement isn't actually going to help you understand the process unless you have clear logic change. And that's what I see missing in the Scottish context.
Yeah. Where do I begin? Actually, let me start, because a lot of this stuff does start from the sort of, is there a better way than GDP? There is a relationship between the prosperity of a country and its happiness, it appears, so you wouldn't. So the answer to your question, I think, is this is in addition to that, but it's actually but actively recognising some of the shortcomings of simply focusing on GDP. The GDP thing actually throws up the equality point that Jeremy was making as well. That certainly, and I'm sorry if I did actually gloss over it, that I think for a number of different dimensions, greater equality, both through the direct impact that would have on the lives of those that have less, and also on how society itself feels about itself, would be important. So that would be pretty close to the top of the list of quick wins. I must be becoming like an academic, actually, because this gives me the chance to say that our next themed program is around the whole subject of increasing equality and realizing human potential, and we'll be deciding on which programs to support in that in the next few weeks. So, and that will run at the beginning of next year. So I'd be very happy to come back and talk further about that. But there's no question that in my mind that the greater equality is important in that. Helping to make hard choices, and I suppose that the points I was making there link back to the equality, and that's why within the framework, having more reference to distribution of activities in terms of income, in terms of health, in terms of intergenerational issues is an important part of I think how the framework can be developed. But in a way that, and this goes back to the point that John was making in his contribution at our conference last week, that a lot of this is actually about beginning to try and turn the way in which we govern ourselves on our head to a certain extent. So it's not just simply relying on a relatively narrow people to look at data, to design policies, to take decisions. It is about finding ways in which the citizens of the country more generally can become engaged in that process. I think so. The work that Oxfam did with the Humankind Index, in beginning with a relatively significant group of people, 3,000 or so, a relatively small group of people, beginning to actually engage people on what's important, why it's important, how it would be best measured, gives then the steer for some of those top-down decisions that would still have to be made, but actually makes people feel more bought into the process as well. So, I mean, in a way that if there was an easy answer, we would have done it. But actually talking about the questions, talking about the trade-offs where there are trade-offs, but also trying to pose questions about policy in terms of where are the synergies, where do things build upon each other? So is it not always, and again, it's the sort of lens you take, not always taking a lens which says, what are the trade-offs, but how can doing one thing begin to contribute to another? And and as far as attribution is concerned, that then makes it a complete nightmare in a way. And it was always the case, even for a relatively narrow area of public policy that some of you remember I used to be involved in. Unambiguous attribution for things that you did to try and develop the country's economy, which may or may not have an effect years down the line, is very difficult. So that's why I think the National Performance Framework, while it is in part a yardstick against which government can be assessed, it's also a wider description of how you assess the state of the society that you're in. So that maybe touching, I think it was one of the points that Duncan made that I've the theory of change point as well, I think, was that was certainly one of the things which came out, that you think about, relating what you're measuring to some sort of some logic chain again, but then tie that back to the logic that emerges from talking to people about what's important to them and why. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Right, time for some other people to exercise their voices then. Yes, please.
It's Peter Reiki from the Young Academy of Scotland, and I speak from just behind Bob as a member of the generation that's rapidly sliding towards the bottom of the U-bend of well-being. And I suppose my point builds on the intergenerational point and David Bell's lecture on inequality, and thinking about the fundamental ways that this is fixed, and how much of this is about anything other than the reallocation of resources from the voting demographic to non-voting demographics. Is it because a lot of what I hear makes me think that it almost is that simple, and I wondered to what extent you think that's important in all of this.
Okay, a good start on the trend that in the second batch of questions you do not have to be a professor aged over 60 to get into the batch. Who else would like to come into this batch? Good.
Bill Pagan, not a professor, but well over 60. Charlie, you made the point of the OECD talking about the need for control, both in the political and the social sense, and you had a very useful slide on the follow-up to the referendum. Is that head of steam something that has changed some of the thinking about engagement? Because it is a huge head of steam, and should it become a future measure? In other words, if in next election the turnout is 65%, and if the one after that it's 45%, and in the one after that is 35%, is that perhaps a proof of failing?
That's an interesting idea. I think sorry.
It's okay. No, yes. The equivalent of Duncan's last seat on the bus.
Thank you. Bill Howitt. I'm not a professor of anything, but I'm over 60, as John is well aware. I'm here tonight in the capacity as chair of Fourth Sector, which is a charity working very much at the sharp end of this kind of framework, trying to help people in very serious unemployment. But the main thing I want to start with, Charlie, thank you very much for dealing with volunteering. I'm president of Volunteer Scotland, so that's nothing to do with me praising you. But I think it's great to see that volunteering and the whole hidden economy and the whole amount of activity and work that goes on until now pretty much unrepresented is actually being taken into this framework, albeit that makes it more difficult. And in passing, can I say to Jeremy that will not be a low-hanging fruit. We've been trying to improve volunteering in this country for as long as Volunteer Scotland has existed. It is not easy. If you've got easy solutions to that, please let us know. My question is a very simple one. I think it picks up from the point over here about engagement and how people know. I was slightly surprised in the huge multitude of things that you've talked about, Charlie, that communication wasn't mentioned, and specifically media. And some of the issues that are flying around here tonight about hard decisions that have to be made. We live in a country where, and I'm talking both UK and Scotland here, where everybody runs around wanting to do this holy grail, and yet we have a media that is presenting politics as if we had a presidential system. It's Mr. Cameron and Mr. Clegg and Mr. Miliband. I'm not going to vote for any of them, but that's the way the media present it. I'm obviously exaggerating here, but my point is a critical part of any engagement and empowerment is the communication, and our media and our system as it stands at the moment, in my view, doesn't help any of this cause.
Thank you. Charlie.
Okay, yeah, some interesting points, which I think actually are all related. I mean, yes, because you can certainly see within the way certain issues are presented, certainly across the UK, a number of simple solutions being offered to various things, which, by definition, are extremely complex, and there's a real desire to try and grab hold of a simple solution, particularly if it fits with with a storyline which works for you. So that is that's the reason why you have to make the effort to actively engage people that build on that head of. So there was it appears that Scotland, through the referendum process, did generate a head of steam where people wanted to be involved. Now, it might have been because there was simply a binary question being discussed, but actually a lot of the discussions that I heard and got involved in actually quickly soon turned to questions about, well, what sort of place do you want to live in? What's the essence of this place? And that's what I think engaged a lot of people. So building on that, and if you don't build on that, and civic engagement certainly is one of the things that the OECD would recommend in any measurement framework. Voting is one way in which you can assess that. If you don't do that, then the danger is that you will have a system which is geared very much towards people, in theory, seeing the need to skew resources towards those that don't vote, but in practice finding it very hard because they don't vote. So they're all related together. That's why, in a way, I suppose. And actually, I thought when I first came to this conclusion, I thought when we started this off, I thought this will be very much about saying these are the very specific things you could put in a national performance framework to make it significantly better. To arrive at a conclusion for me, and I say this is my synthesis of the work that was done, that really the engagement, the empowerment, and the enablement are what's important. So it's not just engagement. I think there is a danger that engagement it doesn't go far enough. It frustrates people. They don't think that they are being given a genuine voice. And so you have to empower and enable them to take part as well. I suppose the analogy for me, and this ties into another piece of work we did in the program, that was done in the program before, is around the impact that employee ownership has on business performance. If you actively involve people in the ownership and the engagement and decision-making within the firm, then by and large, the performance of the business improves. So it's harder to do it. It's easier to do it in the focused environment of a firm, but in a way, that's the analogy that you're trying to take to the country as a whole. It's not simply being run by the group of directors, and maybe there is a sense in that frustration that the board of directors that we nominally elect has become too distant from everybody else. I think that's the frustration we are seeing.
Okay, 5 minutes left. In my experience, in the gatherings that follow events like this, there's always somebody who is saying to their companions, I wish someone had asked him X. So this is your chance to be the person who doesn't have to do that. Yes.
Anne Packard, if I could just take you to the remark you've just made, why then are there relatively so few employee-owned businesses in Britain? There are those we all know about, like John Lewis, but I don't know how many more the collective brains in this room could produce and how many in Scotland. And if it's a model which works, why aren't more people doing it?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question that I don't know the answer to. Certainly, I would refer you to the work that David Erdl and others have done on this. There are significantly more than you think. Everyone always stops at John Lewis, and obviously David's experience, and across a wide range of sectors and businesses as well. So it's more widespread. In part, there are issues of. I know there are issues of financing, but that's not the only story. I don't know enough about it, but it is certainly there is some material on it. In fact, there is, and on our website, there's material from that program. Maybe others have some comments and thoughts on that.
Or indeed on anything. Yes, please. So,
Douglas Robertson, Stirling University. I think the thing that intrigues me about the whole agenda that the Wellbeing takes us into in terms of looking at, in terms of policy outcomes, I think the intriguing thing is that most people in the street don't know anything about this outcomes agenda that's been running for 7 years. So in terms of engagement, this is one of the few events where that type of engagement is actually taking place. Certain groups, obviously, it's been discussed for quite a while. But when we explored looking in the housing aspect and turning it into home, and we looked at the outcome measures that were set within the national policy framework, what was intriguing was how the bureaucracy of the past was still hanging in there. These measures reflected old systems, old arrangements, and while the measures often gave us some indication of something that was useful, the actual indicators that were employed were next to useless. So in a sense, for example, the green space one seemed to be how close you were to a site of special scientific interest. Now, I can understand why people that are promoting sites of special scientific interest want that in that agenda, but I'm not sure that gives me an indication about how relevant living in Fife is if you want water and countryside. So what intrigued me in a sense is if this is a bigger agenda, and I think it is part of a bigger agenda coming out of this crisis. I think it started well before it, but I think this is about re-engaging with the idea of what is the function of public service and public society, and it's challenging a lot of the attitudes in relation to how our current system often creates more problems than it actually solves. I think the other thing that misses from this in terms of the home one is just where health fits in. Health has corralled a massive amount of the budget, and is the health model that we currently have the one that is best suited to addressing the issues which the wellbeing agenda throws up? And I think the challenge for all of this is how does it reshape policy, and in terms of that falling through, who are the winners and losers? Because the current system, the current structures are very, very strong. And I think unless this is a much wider debate engaged with the public as to what are the priorities, then I can see it getting quite trapped. But I think opening up that debate, I think, is quite critical.
Thank you. And one last contribution here.
I'm Sarah Bowyer. I'm from the University of Highlands and Islands, but currently with the Scottish Government. Maybe it's just a simplistic offering, but it was coming back to where you were saying about belonging, and maybe some of this is where people feel they belong within the whole of society. Because I've worked in health with people who would be classed as having health inequalities, and coming back to the question about these businesses that are owned or run by the workers, the products they produce tend to be more expensive, and say the likes of Waitrose, certainly a lot of the people I've worked with wouldn't see themselves as being part of the Waitrose crowd, and they'll say things like, oh, well, those places aren't for me, or I don't belong there, or, well, that isn't where I would be asked to go. So I think it comes back to that more levelling in society of where do people feel they belong.
Thank you. Charlie.
I think they were contributions rather than questions. I'm not sure I necessarily have anything to.
Don't feel denied a
No,
finale
no,
if you would like one.
that's fine. No.
Okay, well, thank you very much for such a strong input into the discussion, and some of the hardest questions I've heard asked for a long time. I don't want to abuse my position in the chair, but I spend a lot of time in various countries talking about this set of issues. And the one thing that's clear to me is that in most of the countries where I spend that time, this discussion could not take place, because the discussion in those countries is a mile further back down the road in terms of how you would even get started on this debate, let alone the sophisticated discussion that's taken place in the room this evening with the masterly survey of the territory that Charlie gave us. So thank you to Charlie, and thank you to you. And Ray, I think you're going to finish us off.
Just very briefly to, on your behalf, thank Charlie and John for their presentation this evening. On behalf of the David Hume Institute, thank you all for coming, and to remind you that we have a drink outside so you can continue the discussion there. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. That was brilliant. It was really, really good.
Cover quite a lot of ground.
You were trying to cover